Colleagues, welcome to the Roger Jowell Lecture. I'm Ian Diamond, and it's an enormous, just like a seriously enormous privilege to have been asked to chair. It's so great also to see so many old friends. So to old friends, all of you, hello, and new friends, it's great to know you. Look, I just wanted to say a few words, if I may, by the beginning. In the early 1980s, I was working at the University of Southampton, where we had a small group that were trying to design surveys and do social statistics. And our heroes at that time were the social and community planning research. And our leaders, Tim Holt and Fred Smith, would often say, what would Roger Jowell think about this? You know? And so Roger Jowell built up in my mind, because I was only in my 20s then, and had got perhaps a little older, but Roger Jowell had this kind of vision in my mind of someone who absolutely knew what was going on, absolutely had social statistics moving forwards in a way that all of us really wanted to do, and believing passionately in the power of data to shed a light on inequality, to shed a light on society in a way to improve people's lives. And that was something that I felt that SCPR and then the NatSen change really was doing. It was a huge privilege then in the early 1990s when we at Southampton worked with NatSen to get some, I see Gracie Allison here, to get some money from the ESRC. And we worked jointly on something called the Centre for Applied Social Surveys, and it was great. Although once I do recall, and I really got to know Roger there, Roger Thomas, who some of you will know was the lead at NatSen, but getting to know Roger and finding someone who was both totally inspirational, but at the same time very firm. And we did have one meeting with the ESRC, which we decided we were going to be firm. I must admit, I got a bit nervous at how firm we were being. But Alison, we were still friends afterwards. But his vision and his total commitment was just so brilliant. And I was then privileged. Again, he invited me onto the technical advisory group of the European Social Survey. And that, let's be honest, wasn't an easy thing to do. International comparability surveys are critically important in my view, but let's not pretend they're easy. And Roger was chairing a multinational group, trying to get a multinational group of social statisticians to agree on anything. It was a speak of diplomacy that I'd never seen the like of. And I learned so much from him in that. And so I really was immensely privileged to be asked and to have the opportunity to just say how much we all missed him and how much he brought to the practice of social statistics that we are so proud to follow on now. And I think this lecture is an absolutely fine way to remember Roger. It's even better this year because Jane's giving it. And I've known Jane since the 1980s as well. When I was in my 20s, obviously. Exactly anything. But Jane has been at the forefront of broadly defined social statistics and demography for a very long time. Jane has led the group in Southampton that I think is a model outside of social science with such breadth. Jane herself, if you ever look at Jane's CV, it has the breadth of, I don't know anyone who has published on Tajikistan, the future of population, as well as a million other things to do with gerontology and other areas. I mean, it's an unbelievable body of work, and we're all privileged, Jane, to hear you tonight speaking on what I think is one of the most important challenges that we face. The Office for National Statistics recently showed that 491,000 people had left the labour force aged over 50 since the pandemic. 491,000. That's what mine is. Let me be clear, there is a confidence interval. But many of them, some of them saying they're retiring, some of them ill health, but many of them talking about the challenges of caring. And so I am so excited to hear what you're going to say, Jane, because I do think we're addressing one of the most important problems our society challenges, whatever our society is facing at the moment. And that's the epitome, in my view, of what Roger Jowell would have wanted to see in this lecture. So allow me to introduce Jane to you and to invite you, Jane, to give your lecture. Thank you.
Very much. Well, good evening, everybody. It's an absolute honour for me to be here tonight and have been asked to give this year's Sir Roger Jowell Memorial Lecture. I had the privilege of knowing Sir Roger during the early part of my career when I was up the road at the London School of Economics. But this place was known as the place that you really needed to come and to be at for social statistics. And in fact, it was a bit of a trip down memory lane, walking down from the Angel today, because when I first came to LSE, I lived on Rosebery Avenue. And then my very first job, when I finished my master's, was actually teaching first year economics at City. I don't think it was this building, I think it was across the road, but so it's an absolute privilege to be back here tonight. And the title of my lecture is The New Rush Hour of Life, Balancing Paid and Unpaid Work in Midlife. And during the lecture, I'm going to draw upon recent research conducted with my colleagues within the Centre for Population Change, which has been funded, thank you, Alison, by the ESRC, funded here, actually, by the ESRC since 2009. And in particular, I'm going to be drawing on recent research which has been conducted as part of the Connecting Generations Research Partnership, which is part of the Centre for Population Change. And I want to extend my thanks to all of my colleagues that I've borrowed their research for tonight. But particularly I want to thank my co-director, Professor Maria of Andrew, who's been my co-author and collaborator for most of my career. And it was actually Maria's early research on multiple roles in midlife, which she conducted when she was at King's during the early 1990s, that inspired us to revisit some of that early research that I'm going to be presenting this evening. So I'll blame my colleagues for any of the things that look dodgy. So during the next 50 minutes or so, I'm going to try and cover 4 areas. First, I'll provide a brief summary of recent trends in population change in the UK. And apologies in advance to Sir Ian and to others to whom much of this will be familiar. But for those of you who don't have a background in demography, I thought it would be useful to give you the overview so then you can understand the context and the motivation for the main part of the lecture. Then building on that, I'll reflect on the implications for the life course and how put forward the proposition that perhaps midlife is emerging as a new rush hour of life. So in demography, we tended to use that terminology for early adulthood, when people were first leaving home, meeting their partners, setting up their homes and starting their careers, and were rushing around in the rush hour of life. But I'm going to argue that actually maybe there's 2 rush hours, or maybe just life never stops being run. And then I'm going to show you some of the research around whether balancing paid and unpaid work in midlife is compatible. And in particular, I'm focusing in on a piece of work that's only just been published, looking at the whether policies around extended working life are actually compatible with the current government's, well, and the past government's approaches to funding long-term care, and then a forward look into the future. And apologies in advance if it gets a little depressing. Stephen said it was a bit depressing when we get into the future, so apologies for that. So turning to the first of these and looking at recent trends in population change, I still actually even though I do hold a couple of senior roles in the University of Southampton, including being Vice President responsible for our civic university gender, but I still teach first years because I love teaching first years. And I say to them that actually being a demographer is a great choice because demography is really simple. You only have to understand three things. Population size and shape is determined just by births, deaths and migration. Of course, it's not that simple because why people have children or why people migrate and how we age into later life is quite complicated. But at a national level, we have to take those three things into account. So I'm going to look at trends in those three components very briefly. So, and you'll see that also, Ian, I've stolen a lot of ONS data as well. So the first of these, really one of the key drivers of the population is the number of births. And this graph shows you the number of live births recorded in England and Wales over the last century in every year since 1925. And there's so many things I could point out to you on this graph. First of all, you can see that the peak in births immediately following the end of the Second World War. Unlike in North America, however, our births then fell back down again because, of course, we had a period of austerity and, in fact, rationing extended into well into the 1950s. So births went back down again, and then we have a second baby boom, which is actually peaking in 1964-65. So if you're in John Lewis and trying to find a 60th birthday card at the moment, that's quite a challenge because there were quite a lot of people born in 1965. And then births started to fall, and you can see some echoes of the 60s baby boom in the 90s and then again in the early 2000s. But it's been in the press quite a lot in the last week or so because ONS has just published its most recent statistics on births, that we're now at the lowest level of the number of births since 1865 or something like that, Ian?
Yeah.
So the birth rate is falling and has gone down. So the other main component of population change is the change in the death rate. And again, this is ONS data, but it shows you how life expectancy has changed over the last 150 years. This is something that I think we need to celebrate, and very often the ageing population is presented as a problem. I've been working on ageing population since about 1985, when I first started working with Paul Johnson on a project at LSE. And I still think ageing is something to be celebrated. And this graph really sums it up. So let me try and put this change in life expectancy into context. And I'm going to do something which is a bit naughty for a demographer because I'm going to use period rates and turn them into something that I shouldn't. But in 1901, the average life expectancy in England and Wales for a man was 45. In 2001, it was 75. That is an improvement of life expectancy at birth of 30 years in a 100-year period. That's equivalent to 3 years in 10, or 3.6 months in a year, or 9 days in a month, or 1.2 days in a week, or just over 7 hours a day. That is an astonishing improvement in life expectancy, and it's something amazing and that we should celebrate. It's not often that demography gets onto the front cover of Time magazine or National Geographic, but there is now a real discussion around how long life expectancy will continue to increase at the rate that it has been increasing. And indeed, we have seen a slowdown in the rate of improvement. So life expectancy is still improving, but the rate has been slowing down. But this change in life expectancy does mean that it does challenge what it means to be old. So rather than picking a chronological age, such as 60 or 65, to define when later life starts, a colleague of ours, Professor Jane Falkingham, in a speech to the European Population Conference a few years ago, suggested that perhaps we should move away from thinking about chronological age to start thinking that we become old when we face a 1% chance of dying. And then we become very old when we face a 10% chance of dying. So I like Jim's idea. So I decided that I would take his idea and have a look at it for England and Wales. And this graph shows the age schedule of mortality based on mortality data from ONS. And the 2031 data is from the latest population projections. So if you plot the age schedule of mortality, you can read off when you face a 1% or a 10% chance of dying. I should say that I know we're a room largely of social statisticians, but not everyone. So the axis shows you the probability of dying per 100,000, and it's in a logarithmic scale. So you face a 1% chance of dying when the number of deaths per 100,000 people is 100, and you face a 10% chance when it's 1,000. So I know it's a bit difficult to read, so I've turned it into a table for you, so you don't have to look at the line. But basically, that 1% chance of dying was at age 50 for men in 1951. And in men in 2001, it was age 65. So 65 really is the new 50. And it was a complete chance that those numbers are so nice and round. For women, it's not quite such a catchy phrase. 69 is the new 56. But it does show you actually how those improvements in mortality translate. And the 10% chance of dying, again, you can see it shifted up from 75 to 87. So I'm going to come back to this when I start to talk about changes in state pension age, because actually you can immediately see perhaps there is some rationale for changing the state pension age that we've been seeing. Now, when I talk to my students, some of them may well be born in some of these years that are in this table, but I don't know, that's maybe one or two people, but certainly you might have your children or nephews and nieces or grandchildren who are born in these years. Now, this is taken from work that Jane Falkingham, who I referred to earlier, did, using a database which is collected by the Max Planck Institute of Demographic Research in Rostock. What it shows is the age at which at least 50% of that birth cohort will survive to. So if you were born in 2005 in the UK, he estimated that 50% of children born in 2005 would live to be 102. Wow. Now, if you knew you had a 50% chance of surviving to 102, how would you organise your life? Particularly that early rush hour of life that I was talking about at the beginning, where you're running around trying to cram everything into your 20s and 30s. Now, I think most demographers will now agree that this work that Jim did in the year 2000 was probably a bit optimistic, but actually, the latest data that we've been looking at in the Centre for Population Change, I have a team of people who work on mortality and mortality predictions and are working closely with colleagues in Titchfield at ONS. We think that probably you've got 50% chance of surviving well into your 90s and maybe a 30% chance of surviving to 100. So it's about a third of children born today are going to survive to celebrate their 100th birthday. Of course, we don't know, because strange things happen in the world, don't they? And we're seeing strange things happening right now. But it really will depend on changes in health risk behaviour, in pollution, in other things, or whether people are ageing healthily. But it puts into context those big demographic shifts we're seeing. But of course, I'm talking about averages. And so I do just want to draw us back to reality that there are still really big differences between different socioeconomic groups and between different regions in the world. So the latest data on life expectancy by local area shows it was over a decade difference between the best postcode and the worst postcode in England and Wales for men, and about 7 years for women. And although life expectancy has generally been improving, that gap between the most highest performing local authorities and the lowest performing local authorities has actually been widening. So not everybody is benefiting from these rises in life expectancy. And I think, again, that's important to bear in mind. So putting these trends in fertility and mortality together, that leads to an ageing population. And this is just the standard age pyramid. It's interesting to take yourself back to that graph I gave of births at the very beginning. If you turn it on its side, it almost gives you the shape of the population, because of course, when you get born, then you age and you move through the life course. We do have people coming into our population at different points, and so that slightly shifts things, but generally births are the thing that is driving the shape of the population. The age composition of population is driven by births, whereas its deaths just kind of shave off the sides. But I did mention migration. This comes from work, again, from another Centre for Population Change colleague, the wonderful Nissa Finney, who's at St Andrews. And she's this is in a paper that's just been published in the Geographical Journal with the latest data from the 2021 census. Basically, it shows, again, the amazing transformation of our population in terms of our ethnic composition over the period 1991 to 2001. So in 1991, the non-white population was around 3 million, or around 7% of our population. But by 2021, this has more than tripled to around 11 million, or 18% of the population. Now, much of the research I'm going to be showing you later on is primarily of the white majority population, but we are starting to see the ageing of our ethnic minority population. So I think that we will need to really focus in on that in future research. So, what do all these changes mean for the life course? In classical sociology, the life course has been conceptualized as a system of rules for ordering key dimensions of life, with some of those rules being legal, such as school leaving age or state pension age, and others are more normative, such as the acceptable age at which young people should start their families. Now, back in the early 1980s, when Ian and I were in our 20s, well, I was probably at school, yes, if you were. The sociologist, and in particular Coley, made the case that there'd been a shift in the life course in Western countries over the past 30 years that had streamlined it. And we were moving towards a common life course where people followed the same path at the same stage in their lives, entering school, leaving home, getting married, having children. And so we could start to think about measuring the life course in stages and transitions, and a whole set of new social statistics techniques started to be developed, like event history analysis. I can see Sarah in the audience,
I could do that.
who did her PhD at Southampton. I think what we've seen over the last 20 years, however, has started to disrupt that life course. And in particular, we're starting to see changes in behaviours that actually make it much more difficult to think about the life course as a linear life course. So, for example, I've just put up Mick Jagger, who is expecting a child in his 70s when he should, in normative terms, maybe have been a grandfather or even a great-grandfather. But we've also seen things like adult children moving back home, boomeranging back home. And it was actually colleagues in Centre for Population Change who first coined that phrase, boomerang children, an article written by myself and my colleague Anne Berrington. But this comes from some of Anne's more recent work, which shows the postponement of residential independence. And I think anyone who's got adult children can recognise this. We've seen a shift up in the age at which children are leaving home, but also returning back to the home. And so the age at which 50% are living away from parents has increased from around 20 to 23 years. So we've extended that period. And we can see a shelf also has developed for young people. And this is likely caused both by fewer people leaving home in their early 20s, but also more people returning back home. And I'll come back to this when we start to get into the juggling things. But so that's a really important shift in the life course. This will take some of you back. Don't expect many of you have seen this logo for a number of years. This was actually my very first research centre funded by ESRC, the Simulating Social Policy in an Ageing Society. And we were funded by ESRC to develop a dynamic micro-simulation model to take us all the way through to the year 2020, which we thought was just going to be amazing. I haven't actually looked to see if we were right or not. I don't think we were. But this work was done by Paul Johnson and Asghar Zaidi. And they looked at how labour force participation rates have changed across cohorts. And they used data going right back using census results all the way back to the 1860s, 1870s. And then I've updated it more recently. A number of things to note for men, because this is men, is that first of all, retirement's a fairly modern phenomena. So if you look at the very oldest cohorts, they are actually still quite high proportions were still working in their 60s and 70s. And then gradually younger cohorts started to retire. The second thing to notice is that men are also they're leaving the labour market earlier and they're entering it later. And the third thing is they have lower overall participation rates. So men are entering later, leaving earlier, and having lower participation rates. Important when we come to think about pension. But generally, it's quite a uniform picture for men. But what is astonishing is what has happened to women over the same time period. So if we take those very early cohorts, basically women worked in their early years, that's 15 to 19, the labour force participation rates were up in the 70s and 80%. But as soon as they started having children, they were withdrawing from the labour market and then they weren't going back. Then you start to see these kind of curves here, where you see that actually labour force participation rates start to rise when children have left home or are starting to become independent. And then you see it getting even more amplified as we go up. And then if we look at the most recent cohorts, which are born in the 1970s of women, you can see that labour force participation rates went up and they don't come down. So women, it's actually the transformation of women's labour force participation that allowed the welfare state to develop during the last century. So if you think about that rise in life expectancy and the emergence of first Lloyd George establishing a pension and then Beveridge and all of the things, what was driving, how were we able to do that at the same time as we were having an ageing population? Well, it's this, because we increased the number of workers in the population and hence the number of taxpayers. So, moving on to midlife, my hypothesis. Having identified some key changes in the life course, I now want to focus in on midlife and in particular think about whether these changes mean that there's a new rush hour of life. I think it's important to think about the going back to Maria's very early research that she did when she was at King's College with Karen Glazer. I don't know if Karen's here. But you can hold a multiplicity of roles, and their research looked at being a partner, a parent, a grandparent, a daughter, a son, a worker, a carer, a volunteer. You can hold many roles. And within the Connecting Generations research programme, we're now starting to focus on whether you can hold all those roles simultaneously, or whether if you hold one set of roles, what's the implications for holding the other sets of roles? So we've looked at rising female labour force participation in general when we looked at the cohorts, but I thought it was useful just to pull this out for looking at women aged 50 to 64 explicitly. And you can see that that rise has been continuing over the last 40 years. So in 1992, just under half of women aged 50 to 64 were in employment, but this had risen to over 2/3 by 2023. At the same time, we've also seen increasing pressure on local authority social care budgets. I think this is something that's familiar to all of us. But we are now expecting 81% of councils expect to overspend their adult social care budget this financial year, which I think finished a couple of days ago, actually, didn't it? 2024-25. And a third of councils are required to make in-year savings. So when we see this pressure on local authority social care budgets, basically, if you have a relative who's available to take care of you, the councils would prefer, really, the family to step in and do that. And it's fantastic that our census is now collecting information on caring. Before we were dependent on some of our social surveys to capture that information. But this shows you the age distribution of people providing unpaid care from the last census. And you can see that 1 in every 5 women aged 55 to 59 are providing some form of informal care. And I think the question wording in the census is care is to providing care to frail or older people who have long-term physical or mental health conditions. So it is pointing to adult social care rather than childcare, which I will come back to in a moment. And if we look at the hours of care, again, you can see here that so the really intensive caring is actually the dark blue bars. That's 50 or more hours of care. If we look at men, it's interesting, slightly different picture for men. We do see that peak in midlife, but we also see this big peak in later life, and that is actually older men caring for their partners in later life, and very intensively as well. very important. And we have fantastic data on carers as well from Understanding Society, and I'll come back to Understanding Society in a moment. This is allows us to look at who people are caring for, and you can see that the vast majority of care in midlife is actually going to a parent, whereas in later life it's going to a spouse or partner. But interestingly, you can also see a rise as we move into mid and then later life in caring for friends and neighbours, which is something I will come back to. Well, but these changes that I've been highlighting also have led us to look at the emergence of what we're calling a double sandwich generation. So the sandwich generation used to be people who are caring for their children and parents, but now what we're seeing is we're seeing people caring for their parents and their grandchildren. And one of the reasons why grandparental care has really emerged as a key issue is it's then facilitating their adult daughter to participate in the labour market. So we saw that big rise in female labour force participation. We've seen the end of the male breadwinner model. I think anyone living in London knows you've got to have 2 salaries in order to pay for accommodation. And so actually it's not a choice to give up work. But when you have your children, both parents need to be in work. And so grandparents become a really important part of that. And we've done research at the University of Southampton. We're doing a whole set of kinship modelling work at the moment and looking at expected numbers of surviving kin at different ages. And you can see that these changes in life expectancy and the changes in the timing at which you have children means there are more people having more surviving kin at different ages. I'll also come back to. We also looked at this using data from the National Child Development Study, which was first established at City University. Interesting, it's called the National Child Development Study because they're now at they're going into the field and collecting data from when they're age 65 at the moment, I think. But we used that data when they were age 55. For those of you who don't know, this is an amazing data set where we collected data on all children born in a particular week in 1958, and then they've been followed right across their life. So we can look at changes across their life course. But age 55, 80% of the NCDS had at least one parent and parent-in-law, and 29% had one parent and parent-in-law and one grandchild alive, of whom, if you were in that kind of double sandwich generation, half were providing care to both generations. And 1 in 20 were providing over 10 hours up and 10 hours down. 10 plus hours. And we've also done work with our colleagues across Europe. So this is using the share data, which is a different ERIC to the ESS. But this is the survey of health and retirement in Europe. And you can see this just shows how the proportion in different countries where you have at least one parent and at least one grandchild at the same time. And you can see that actually being in a double sandwich is not just in the UK, but is actually a spread across Europe. So, balancing paid and unpaid work. How compatible are these different policies? So just to remind us, we saw that the change in life expectancy and the changes in when we might expect to have a 1% or 10% chance of dying. And this really lies behind some of the recent government policies in terms of changing state pension age. And between 2007 and 2014, it was a really very busy time for pension legislation and for people who work in social policy who are interested in these issues. So when I first started working, I thought that I would retire at 60, and then the goalposts moved a bit up to 65. And now for me, I'm hoping I might retire at 67, but you never quite know because things get shifted. But this just shows you how the pension age has changed from the different legislation. So the Pensions Act in 1995 introduced the equalisation at 65 between men and women in a phased way. Then the 2011 Act speeded it up. And that's the act that the WASPy women, I think, are mainly concerned about because they didn't get the notice that the pension age was being speeded up. And then the 2014 speeded it up even more and has raised it to 67, and then it will go up to 68. But we've got Mike Daly in the audience, so he can tell us if there's it's going to go up to 69 or 70.
I don't care, I've already got my state pension.
Okay. For me, that additional 7 years of work, and I started working at 22 when I was teaching economics at City. That's actually given, it's an equivalent to another 20% on my working life. So there's a big shift in single people's life courses. So, and now, as well as the change in the state pension age, there's been a whole plethora of other policies around first extended working lives, and then it was rebranded as fuller working lives, and then it was rebranded as 50+ choices. And now I think it's actually just been rebranded again as help and support for older workers. But essentially wanting people to stay in work. So we decided we would look at the relationship between assuming caring responsibilities and changes in employment. And so the first thing we did was we used the National Child Development Survey and looked at people who were in work at age 50 and then followed them through to age 55 and looked at if you assumed caring responsibilities in that period, what happened to your work. And I'm not going to give you lots of regression analysis. I can just shout to this audience, I think, we're small enough, but thank you. Okay,
That one.
mute this one. Oh, we're online, aren't we? So, the research has been published in Ageing and Society, so you can go to the article if you want all the regression results. But effectively, what we found was those who were providing personal care or who assumed personal care were 1.79 times more likely to stop working than those who weren't providing care. And then we also looked at changing intensity of care. And men who increased their caring hours were 1.65 times more likely to stop working, and increasing the intensity of care almost doubled the risk of leaving work. Now, it kind of isn't rocket science. We sort of knew that would be the case, but when you're talking to government, you need the empirical data to actually make the argument. So this paper actually provided the first empirical evidence that actually taking up caring responsibilities in midlife does lead to some people exiting the labour market. Of course, NCDS is a very particular birth cohort. And so we've now just very recently repeated the analysis using Understanding Society, or the UK Household Longitudinal Study, to give it its full title. And we looked at people in a much wider age range, because of course we were just in NCDS, we were just looking at 50 to 55, which is quite a narrow age range. So here we extended it to looking at everybody between 50 and 64, and we looked at it over a decade-long period, just stopping before the pandemic, because the pandemic we felt might cause some disruption. And again, using discrete time survival models, we found that if you assumed caring, you're more likely to leave work. And the probabilities were actually very similar to the NCDS, so it's actually quite stable. And that was published in Journal of Social Policy in November, will be one of my ref papers. Yes, that's got that one in the bag. And then the Centre for Population Change is partnered with colleagues at the Resolution Foundation on our new Connecting Generations grant. And they bring out this wonderful intergenerational audit every year. If you haven't gone onto their website to look at it, please do. And in the latest intergenerational audit, again, we repeated the analysis, but this time taking everyone between age 16 and state pension age, and taking a longer time frame, so covering the pandemic and going through to 2021-22. And again, you can see the results there. So our message to the government is that at the moment, it's not actually possible for some people to combine work and intensive caring. So employers need to do more to support people fulfilling their caring responsibilities. I would say that if you give up work in your 50s, not only are you giving up your income at that moment in time, you're also giving up your future income in terms of you're interrupting your pension contributions. So there's lots of things that DWP is suggesting, including having a midlife MOT and checking. And this is there is a growing recognition, I think, now, and employers are starting to be more flexible, but we probably need to do more. I think Ian said that I've got quite a wide CV. I get distracted quite easily. So in the 1990s, I went off to Central Asia, which I'm happy to talk about later. Well, I did work on Tajikistan. But I got a bit distracted couple of years ago because I started going through the menopause, and I had to get up in senior leadership meetings and open the window and all sorts of things. And I thought, gosh, there's not much research on the menopause. And we went back to the wonderful NCDS, and lo and behold, they asked questions on the menopause. So we were able to then go back and look at the impact of suffering severe menopausal symptoms during your 50s on women's employment. And you can see there that's been published in Maturitas, which is a journal that publishes research on the menopause. And you can see again that there was heightened risks of exiting the labour market, and statistically significant. This research got picked up by the Southampton MP, Caroline Norris, when she was actually the chair of the Equalities Select Committee. And then I got invited to Downing Street to talk about the menopause, which was great. And then this summer, I got invited to talk to the Royal Bank of Scotland about the menopause, not Scotland, Royal Bank of Canada. And this little piece here is actually some analysis that the Royal Bank of Canada's economists did on the impact of the menopause on women's pensions. So the next piece of research is going to be looking at care and menopause and midlife, but I haven't got those results yet. You have to invite me back. So I've got a couple of minutes left, and I just want to turn to the future now and look at the squeezed middle's own future. Takes back to these birth rates. And I think it's in particular, it's focusing on that 1960s baby boom. And I will confess, I am one of those 1960s baby boomers, which is why I think I'm obsessed with midlife at the moment. And those born in 1965 are celebrating their birthday this year, and they will be 80 in 2045. And it's the aging of that birth cohort forward that is actually causing a lot of concern in Whitehall and in other prime ministries, because it feeds through into these population projections where you can see there's just this dramatic rise in the number of people aged 80 plus and then 90 plus as we move forward to 2055. So I asked my team who do the kinship modelling whether they could do some kinship modelling work for us and take it forward up to 2060. So they've just done this. This is quite hot off the presses, and I don't expect you all to disentangle it. But what I would say is it's this row here that I think is the one that should be concerning to policymakers. Because it's not, of course, the average number of kin you have, but it's whether you have any children at all. And that 1960s baby boom are the most childless since 1920s. So 20% of the 1960s baby boom finished their reproductive life without having any natural children. Of course, they might have stepchildren, and they might have nephews and nieces, and they might have different kin. And you can see that actually they have quite a lot of siblings. So they will have nephews and nieces, because that 1960s baby boom, on average, I think total fertility was around 2.4. That's where that magical 2.4 family comes from. They will have siblings who will have children. But I think aging without children is going to be a particular challenge that we need to think through. And as social statisticians, we might need to start thinking about how we capture those one step removed kinship relationships, because none of our surveys really capture any information on those. We've barely started capturing outside of the household relationships. I think 20 years ago, we started saying, okay, we can't just concentrate on the household roster. We need to start capturing other information about people's direct kin. But I think we now need to start capturing information on the one step removed kin. So that's something to think about. So my concluding thoughts are the population is going to continue to age, and it's going to continue to diversify. We will need to start doing more research on different kinship patterns for different minority ethnic groups. My team aren't doing that yet, but I'm hoping that they will move on to that. Social science research is going to remain critical as we move forward in providing the in-depth understanding of our changing society and economy. And we need to rise to the challenge of meeting an ageing society. And it will require governments, businesses, and families to all pivot and change. So thank you very much. If you want to find out any more about Connecting Generations, that's the website to go to. Thank you.